I just came back from lifting a trophy. All right, welcome back, vintage gamers. This weekend, I flew out to Columbus, Ohio, and played in the Buffalo Chicken Dip Legacy Vintage Open, the first one held, and I came back victorious. So I wanted to do just a quick video, go through the weekend, what happened, how I got to choosing my deck and making the card choices that I did. Just a little tournament recap for the people who are following along at home, but maybe don't follow along on things like Twitter. So the Vintage Open was held at Brewdog Brewery and Hotel in Columbus, Ohio. It was a pretty high cost to entry event, but the nice part of it was that it was full proxy vintage, so anyone could attend regardless if they had the paper cards or not. And the first place prize for this event was an unlimited time vault. There were some other prizes among the top 8, including a volcanic island, underground seas, and things like savannas. So a pretty nice set of prizes, and it was held at like a really pretty cool place. I'll show you some pictures. We ended up with 50-ish players for this event, held in this room, which was attached to the brewery. So there's a big building that's the brewery. The brewery has a huge restaurant area and also a hotel area. And this is actually the beer museum. So the beer museum, we cleared out the floor and put all the tables in and held a 50-player vintage event here. So it was pretty cool. Had the big tables. We had on this side over here, there was a feature match set up. I don't think by the time this video airs or right now that the VODs are not yet on YouTube, but they will be on YouTube on the Buffalo Chicken Dip Legacy YouTube channel. I have a feature match in round 1, and then in the semis and the finals. And I also did commentary in a few of the rounds as well. So definitely, if you want to check out, 9 rounds of vintage, there will be 9 rounds of paper vintage coverage that you'll be able to check out if you didn't see it live on Twitch. So here's a couple more pictures. This is inside the restaurant, and you can see the big brewery stuff over here on the other side of this window pane. Very, very cool. Just a huge area. This is the hotel attached to the brewery. And then this is actually the view outside of my room in the hotel. You're just like sitting here with the cases and stuff. The casks of beer, I should say, maybe. Barrels, casks? I don't know. Either way, I just want to say it was a pretty cool place. Pretty sweet tournament. And the tournament did, of course, feature some lunch and some buffalo chicken dip. And it was a really good time. Overall, I go to tournaments a lot for the gathering and the experience and getting to hang out with cool people and meet people. And that was something I got to do a lot of. I got to say hi to a lot of people for the first time, people who watch on Twitch or YouTube. I got to also see people who I don't see very often. So all in all, the community part of this event was really, really nice. And what that does typically happen to be the case for most vintage events. The vintage community is really a perfect spot, I think, in between, casual and competitive, where everyone is there to have a good time and make friends, but you're still, trying to win and playing some, high power Magic. So I went into this event looking at the online metagame and believing that the online metagame would probably similarly mirror what would happen in paper, mostly due to the fact that the event was full proxy. So you could have any deck, you could play any deck you wanted. And for this event, I expected there to be a lot of blue-black Urza Saga, Lurrus Saga decks. These, kind of controlling 5 Wasteland, 4 Urza Saga, blue-black decks. I expected there to be a lot of Oath. Oath had just recently won a vintage challenge. It's a very vintage deck in the same way that PO is a very vintage deck. It's kind of a strategy that you can only do in vintage, and it makes, it produces the good vintage brain chemicals. So I expected a high number of Oath players. I did still expect some number of initiative players, some number of aggro shops players, and even some coveted jewel players. Those are the kind of decks that I thought I would see in a paper event that didn't have any kind of monetary restrictions for cards. And so what I did is I have not had a lot of success recently with Paradoxical Outcome. I do not think that Doomsday is in a particularly good spot. And those are the two decks I was really looking to play in paper. However, I do own most of Oath of Druids because after I won the PTQ with the Pernicious Deed, Archon of Cruelty Oath deck, I actually bought most of that deck just because I thought it'd be really cool to have. Felt like a nice keepsake to, remember, like, super cool tournaments and things like that. So I actually do own a lot of the Oath cards, and I decided that I would like to revisit this Show and Tell Oath deck. So a small background on this version of Oath of Druids. When Atraxa was released, I quickly postulated that this might be one of the strongest cards for creature-wise in all of Magic, and that it was definitely something that was worth oathing into. I think I still probably undersold and underestimated exactly how good this card was going to be. But I, of course, made the Atraxa video shortly after Atraxa came out, and I put together multiple Atraxa Oath lists when it originally came out. Some of them were more controlling. Some of them were even more combo than this. They were playing Show and Tell and Omniscience, cards like Emrakul, trying to basically, win the game on the spot kind of deal. And I was really happy to see that the deck ended up carrying on after my initial video, because for Vintage, a lot of times I do a lot of deck brewing because I think it's good for the channel and it's good to show people what you can do in Vintage. But a lot of times I don't get to play the decks that I brew very much afterwards because I have to move on to the next deck. And there's not actually that many Vintage players, so the chance that a deck gets like picked up and iterated on is actually fairly low. But this deck did not fall away and have no people pick it up. I think one of the biggest pilots and the reasons that this deck is very popular now is No Props, who sometimes in the stream. No Props definitely tested this deck for a long time, making changes and did very well in challenges. And other people very recently have been picking up that this deck is actually an incredible answer to the Lurrus Saga deck. So the blue-black Lurrus Saga deck is very, very weak against a green enchantment. It's hard for the colors blue-black to interact with enchantment very well. And so this deck actually operates on a pretty good access against what was quickly becoming one of the more popular decks in the format. So with recent, challenge victories by notable people on Twitter, people have been picking up this deck a lot. And I actually thought, yeah, this deck would be a really good call for the tournament, just if we make a couple tweaks. And I didn't change the current, stock build of this deck very much. I'll go over some of the tweaks we made right now. One of the most important parts, I think, when playing this deck is understanding how the mirror works. The mirror is extremely unintuitive magic because Oath of Druids is a symmetrical effect where it's happening on each player's upkeep, and the person with the most creatures the person with the least number of creatures is the one getting the Atraxa. You end up in a sub game in the mirror where you don't actually want to be the one casting Oath of Druids. You want to be the one who has more Forbidden Orchards. So a lot of sideboarding in the mirror is actually like taking out some number of Oath of Druids, making sure you have a lot of ways to interact with, keeping your Orchard Druids Forbidden Orchards in play and getting rid of your opponent's Forbidden Orchards. And Oko is a serious, serious part of the mirror because even though an Atraxa can resolve, if it just becomes an Elk, things get quite difficult. So the number one thing you need to know when playing this deck is how to play the mirror. And so when you have that idea of things like boarding out 3 Oath of Druids, 3 Show and Tells, stuff like that, then you end up with these very odd blue-green control mirrors where you're actually fighting over lands a lot. And it's just something that you have to be cognizant of, experience, and actually have some play testing in that kind of subgame. And so what I did with the deck list is I made 2 major changes. One is I cut Narset. I don't like Narset in this deck. I don't think you can protect Narset, which turns her mostly into an Impulse. Obviously, it's a Planeswalker you can get off an Atraxa, but you almost always want to get an Oko as your Planeswalker off of Atraxa. Basically, I don't think Narset is worth it as just an Impulse, and so I think the slot is somewhat wasted. Instead of playing Narset, I instead played a 3rd Oko. As I said, Oko is extremely pivotal in the mirror. It is the most important spell to resolve in an Oath of Druids mirror is your Oko. Oko means you are winning the war over Oath triggers in terms of number of permanent creatures in play. It means you're turning off your opponent's Atraxas and winning the battle on the ground. Oko is extremely important, so playing less than 3, I felt, would be making the mirror less favored for me. So I cut an Narset and I played an Oko. And then the second thing I did is I cut a Force of Negation and played a Strip Mine. Now, Force of Negation is fairly good in game 1 in the mirror. or in general, just because it's a counterspell for Oko. But like I said, I really wanted the ability to interact with my opponent's Forbidden Orchards. So while the Strip Mine, could probably also be Boseiju 3, I don't really like playing 3 of the same legendary land. Though I think afterwards I might even want to put a third Boseiju in the sideboard. No worries. See you on Eternal Weekend. So Strip Mine interacts with Urza Saga, and it interacts with Forbidden Orchard, and it interacts with Bazaar. And I really felt like this kind of additional spell land, especially being able to get it off of an Atraxa when you don't find a Boseiju, was pretty important. All your Atraxas, you want them basically all to hit like Time Walk or Show and Tell, Force or Fluster, Boseiju or Strip Mine, and Oko. Like those were, and like some Moxen for fast mana. And you really want to make sure you have a lot of those kind of cards in your deck to make sure you hit them. The sideboard is still fairly stock, but with a couple major changes. One, I did move that negation to the board. I don't like playing more than 2 negations. Some lists will play a ton of negations, but like you end up being a little bit too clunky with too many dead draws. I changed a Force of Vigor to an Energy Flux. I think an Energy Flux is a bit more of a haymaker versus aggro shops, and I just wanted to have that additional tutorable like wombo option against aggro shops, and I also kind of like it against some of the more artifact oriented saga builds. Yeah, this deck is very favored against blue black Bowmaster in blue black Bowmaster's current iteration. You can make the Bowmaster deck better against it, but right now it's very good against that. Leyline of the Void is just still the best card against playing against Bazaar. It's obviously has some dyssynergy with Oath of Druids in the fact that they can both be Vigored at the same time, but you just want to be playing Leylines. I wanted to have Mindbreak Trap because I think Mindbreak Trap is important to have your opponents maybe respect it or also just like save games, but I don't want to play multiple Mindbreak Traps because it is kind of a clunky card. And then the big thing is a lot of lists in online right now are not playing Serra's Emissary. Serra's Emissary is the anti-creature haymaker in Oath currently. It's just you and your creatures gain protection from a chosen card type. So most of the time you're naming creature, and you're bringing this card in against initiative decks. You're bringing this card in against Bazaar decks, and you're bringing this card in against workshop decks. And so I've kind of felt those 3 decks actually would have a pretty high metagame presence at this event. And one of the really, really nice parts of this deck in comparison to other Oath decks is you don't actually have to take out your Atraxas. When you play a controlling 2 creature Gaia's Blessing Oath list, you actually, have to swap out your Atraxas. But when you play against most of the decks I just mentioned, Initiative Bazaar and aggro shops, any of your 7 creatures, Atraxa, Serra's Emissary, and Sphinx of the Steel Wind, are all going to win the game if you put them in play most of the time. And so what you can do is play all 7 of them because you have 4 Show and Tells in your deck. So you don't cut any Atraxas. You bring in your Serra's Emissaries and your Sphinxes. And a lot of times you'll cut things like, Flusterstorm or Mental Misstep. It really depends on which of those 3 matchups you're playing against. Like Negation is usually dead in a lot of those matchups. Against Bazaar, Oko is like very bad. Citadel is pretty bad, and you don't need top once you cut Citadel. So there's a lot of different things you can cut. And then the final, I think, great tech piece that I had for this weekend is Karakas. And I felt like Karakas would be an extremely good tool for blue-black Lurrus / like Esper Lurrus style decks and the Mirror. So in the Mirror, you obviously get to bounce away your opponent's Atraxa, or a lot of the times in like the Lurrus matchups, you get to bounce your Atraxa back to hand if something is going to happen to your Atraxa. And that's not a huge detriment in this version of Oath because you're playing 4 Show and Tells and Flash. So the Atraxa does double duty where you're bouncing your opponent's creatures, things like Lavinia, things like Lurrus, and then you're also sometimes saving your Atraxas, getting to reuse them in things like Show and Tell, Flash, and Forcible. So those are the changes I made for this weekend. I have a nice, horrible paper deck list photo for you here because that's kind of required. You play a paper event, you take a bad photo that no one can read. So here's the deck in paper. You can see in this box right here, that's the Time Vault that we won. And I was very excited to play. I had all the cards except I just proxied the power. When you're traveling across the country and you don't need to bring the power, you probably shouldn't bring the power. So, we talked about earlier what I expected the metagame to be. How close was I? Basically right on the money. There, with a big notable exception. So the most played deck in this tournament was Oath. There were 11 Oath pilots in this tournament. 6 players on Saga decks, blue black Saga decks. There were 5 players on combo shops. I think 4 of them were Jewel or close to Jewel, and 1 was Smelting Vat. And then the big thing that I did not expect was 4 Beseech players. And one thing that my deck is not good against is Beseech. I definitely don't have a good Beseech matchup. So I was very happy to see this metagame because I felt like I was the most prepared person in the room for the Oath Mirror. That ended up being somewhat true. I think there was maybe one other Oath pilot who was as prepared. And then I think some of the best players on the room were playing Blue-Black Lurrus Saga, which gives me a nice extra edge versus players who I think are very strong. So we end up with a good metagame call, exactly what we're looking for, and we can jump into just the tournament recap. So I'm going to go through, I think using this is going to be the best way. I don't have like notes taken for this event, so I'm just going to go off of what I remember, and some of these rounds will be shorter than others. Round 1, we had feature match against a Grixis control deck. No. That's a Jeskai deck. So this is a Jeskai Lurrus deck. Jeskai is much better against my deck than... can I zoom in on this? I can. Kind of. Jeskai is much better against Oath than Blue-Black Lurrus is. And the big reason for that is actually, cards like Prismatic Ending, even Swords to Plowshares. Sometimes answering an in-play Atraxa can be enough. It's not always, and it probably isn't usually enough, but sometimes it can be. But this player ended up not playing as many Prismatic Endings. In fact, I don't think there are any Prismatic Endings. And so that actually makes the matchup, pretty good. What you can do in Jeskai as well is play things like Containment Priest, which is something you have to look out for. I think I can do this, but then I have to go back and forth. Yeah. Okay, I'll do that. So yeah, just a pretty reasonably stock Jeskai Lurrus deck, but didn't have the sideboard pieces that I was super afraid of, things like Prismatic Ending or Containment Priest. I can't really remember a lot about the games. I don't think they were particularly close. I believe I put Traxxas into play pretty quickly. It's very hard for this deck to answer a Resolved Oath, especially if you don't have Prismatic Ending. So that was, not super crazy of a match. This match will be on the YouTube VOD because it was in the feature match area. So that was a round 1 win against Jeskai. And then we went to round 2. Round 2, we played against not Lurrus Saga. We played against Esper Saga deck. Oh, it had 1 ring in it. I didn't actually see any 1 rings. That's interesting. Oh my goodness, there were 4 Grafdiggers cages. Wow. That is not something I knew. This was a very fun match. In game 1, I remember just getting my butt whooped. I kept a hand that was like Counterspell, Mystical, Probe, some lands, maybe it was a mulligan, and I probed my opponent, and she had like, oh god, it was like Ancestral Force, Demonic, like restricted card hand, and I just got completely rolled over. Game 2 went a lot better, and then game 3, I think there was supposed to be a cage that was fetched, and it wasn't fetched, and it ended up being enough for me to squeak by. But it was very close. It was a super close match. I think I may have won one of the games at like 1 life or something like that. But this did not seem like a super good matchup, especially with that many cages. I kind of like the matchup still because you do have access to like Vigor against Saga, but I don't know. The Esper Lurrus deck is not, sorry, the Esper Saga deck is not really a deck that's played too much anymore. So that was a nice, pretty lucky way to get through round 2. Round 3, we played against Bug Lurrus, which was really interesting. Game 1 was maybe a 30 or 35 minute game. I remember resolving an Oath of Druids on like turn 1 or turn 2, and my opponent not blinking an eye, untapping and Assassin's Trophying the Oath, and I was like, I did not expect my Lurrus opponent to have Assassin's Trophy in their deck. The big problem was it just didn't really have enough action, and it had even more creatures than like a blue-black Lurrus control deck. So like when you're in the situation, you as this opponent's deck, you can't really like hold your creatures back. You need to win the game with creatures. You don't have like a crazy draw engine. You can like sometimes maybe do like a wasteland lock, but it's not super easy. So it really puts the opponent in a very hard spot. And so like they have to put out their creatures, and if I just have an early oath that they don't have an answer for, it's very hard for them to win. I think one of the most interesting plays of the whole tournament happened in this set. In game one, maybe 30 minutes into game one, I had an Oko, which went -5, trade my food for my opponent's Lurrus, and then cast Oath of Druids from my yard with the Lurrus that I stole, and put an Atraxa into play and win the game, which I don't think I've ever done before, and was extremely, extremely fun. I was just like trying to figure out how to advance the game state, because I had a Oko that I was protecting, but they had a lot of Tarmogoyfs and stuff. We had like exchanged a couple Bowmasters. It was a very weird game, but I was able to like steal a Lurrus and rebuy an Oath, and that was really, really cool. So that puts me at 3-0 and going into round 4. And in round 4, we played against an Oath of Druids mirror, and I think this was probably one of the harder matches of the tournament. The opponent was definitely in the know and understanding about how the mirror is going to operate as a control deck. And you can actually see they had some serious mirror tech with Managorger Hydra in their Oath of Druids sideboard. I was pretty scared going into this match because I knew about the Hydra tech, because before we played this round 4, I knew my opponent had played 3 Oath Mirrors before this 4th round. So because both of us were planning to board out a lot of our oaths and our show and tells, what you can do is, like, because the game is becoming a bug control deck versus bug control deck, you can bring in these Managorger Hydras. And I think one of the reasons was because they were really good against Bowmaster. You can't like kill this with a Bowmaster. And so what I did is I just didn't bring in Force of Vigors, and I brought in Dismembers. So I had Dismember ready for Managorger Hydra. I didn't even bother playing Force of Vigor. I felt like with my Besagers and stuff, I had enough answers to like a Citadel. And so I had a plan basically. Game 1 was extremely interesting because I basically removed a little bit of my opponent's permission and then jammed an early show and tell with an Orchard in play. Which is like not exactly, I'm not saying it's a great play, because show and tell against the other 4 Atraxa deck, or, you know, them having Citadel in their hand or something, lots of things can go wrong. But it felt like a good opening. So I jammed an Atraxa. They didn't have a good follow-up. They put in an Oath, and I put in an Atraxa. And my Atraxa hit an Oko and a Boseiju, among some other things. And so the way that game panned out is my opponent immediately had an Oko to answer my Atraxa. So they were able to turn off my 7/7 and make it into a legendary Elk. And then I was able to immediately resolve my own Oko. So then we had an Oko battle on the ground, but it was really hard to attack their Oko because there's like tons of spirits on both sides. They had like a natural 2 orchards in hand. So even though I had an orchard, I couldn't like wrestle control of the Oath trigger because I was just not getting ahead. But I always had the Boseiju that I found off the Atraxa. So if I ever fell behind on spirit tokens, I could instead just Boseiju the Oath. So we were doing like a little bit of a spirit token off and like trying to figure out ways to like get ahead on the spirit token battle. And what I ended up doing at some point is giving up on the spirit token battle, elking my spirits and killing the Oko first. And then with an active Oko in play and multiple elks, Bosejuing the Oath of Druids lets me just kind of ride the card advantage from the Atraxa all the way to victory. So that was like a really pretty cool game 1. And then in game 2, I don't remember it being as, I think I just had the right answers. Like I had a Dismember that killed a spirit token blocker, which let me kill the Oko in the Oko mirror. And then once I had the Oko advantage, then it was just like too late. It was really, really hard. Like a resolved Oko is quite hard for the mirror to deal with. Wow, they were actually also on 3 Okos. Nice. I like this build. Spell Pierce, 2 Fluster, 2 Boseiju, a Portal, and 2 Sarahs. Yeah, like I said, I think this was a matchup I was like pretty looking forward to because I just thought it would be a very competitive match, and it definitely was. So that was awesome. That was round 4. So after round 4, I am 4-0. There's one other 4-0 player, so I am able to draw in round 5. In round 5, I actually got to go do commentary, which was really awesome. I basically just like got a beer and went over and I commentated for this match. And I actually think this is the match I remember the most because what I commentated on was a matchup between the MTGO user Hank the Obese Lee, who was on like a blue-white version of Lurrus Saga, playing against a Beseech player. And I was just very impressed by the Beseech player and how they navigated the game. It was a very calm and controlled game where they like hit land drops and played through a Lavinia. And it was just an awesome thing. And I was like basically when I was doing the commentary, I ended up just being completely wrong, which I thought was awesome because I most of the time I have an idea of how things are going to work out in vintage games. And when I'm just proving completely wrong, I feel like it's so cool and interesting. But like I had to tell that person ended up making top 8, but I had to find them later and be like, that was like one of the coolest matches that I've watched all day. So hopefully, if you do end up finding the Buffalo Chicken Dip Legacy video after watching this video, definitely go watch round 5 feature match. That was awesome. Round 6 was Beseech versus Esper Saga, which I commentated on because I drew into top 8 in round 6. That was not as interesting as the really crazy Beseech versus Lurrus matchup, but it was pretty cool too. The player from that round 6 on Beseech ended up sneaking in on Breakers, and we played in the quarterfinals. That was Matt Hazard, and so this was a Beseech deck. I'm really interested to see if there was anything special in this deck. Apparently, it's 59 cards, so that's special. I'm sure there's just something missing. But I played against Beseech, and this was a crazy 3-game match because what happened in this one was I probed my opponent, and they had a basically all-power hand, and I was like, it's going to be pretty hard to win. But I have a force. I can maybe pull together, sneak something through. And then they untap and they top deck Thoughtseize, and my whole hand just basically fell apart. Like I had a counter magic, but they had a Yogg-Will, so even if I counter something, they just untap and they bring it all back. And I basically got run over in game 1. In game 2, it was I can't remember if this happened in game 2 or in game 3, but in one of the games in game 2 or game 3, I resolve a turn 1 Oath. I think it's game 2. I resolve a turn 1 Oath. My opponent untaps, plays Mox Time Walk, and then passes back to me and dress downs my first Atraxa trigger. And I was like, okay, that's fine. We're gonna be okay. I actually didn't think it was gonna fine. We're gonna be okay because my hand was like turn 1 Oath with Orchard, turn 2 Oath with Orchard, and that was it. And so I really needed my Atraxa. I needed 1, my opponent not to kill me on turn 1. And then 2, I needed to untap, get an Atraxa trigger, and get permission to like counter their powerful stuff. But I didn't get any permission because there was a dress down. And then I'm not exactly sure what happened, but I think my Atraxa may have gotten Chain of Vapored and put back into my hand. So then on a second Atraxa comes down off of Oath, and that one also gets dress downed. So there were 2 dress downs post board. And so oh no, it was worse than that. I went to attacks. They Chain of Vapored the Atraxa back into my hand. I show and tell the Atraxa back into play, and he put in dress down with the Atraxa. And at the time, I was trying to determine if I was supposed to show and tell a Citadel or an Atraxa, and I felt like, oh man, I just felt like so silly. I was like, oh, they're gonna untap and kill me. But Thankfully, they didn't have the combo when they untapped, so I, flipped over my deck again with Oath of Druids and found enough permission to get through that game. Game 3 was kind of odd because my opponent probed my hand, and my hand was very good. It was like Vamp, Force of Will, Force of Negation, Force of Vigor, Atraxa, Mindbreak Trap, some lands maybe. So it was like a bunch of permission and then a possible Oath or something like that. And my opponent went like probe into Mox Demonic straight into Mindbreak Trap. And I was like super happy. I was super relieved. I'm like, I got this Mindbreak Trap out of my hand. I got, I don't have to deal with that anymore. I got a pretty major card from their deck. And I think I vamped for an Oath, but it was kind of questionable if I should be vamping for an Oath or if I should be vamping for like an Ancestral or even a Flash. But I vamped for an Oath, played Oath on turn 2. Oath was countered by Force. And then I basically held up my permission for a turn or two until I found another piece of action and then carried the game through there. So that was pretty crazy. I didn't think I was going to win this. Like I said, the Beseech deck is probably a bad matchup for the Oath deck. I don't really want to face true combo with the Oath deck. So that was like dodging a really, really tough matchup. In the semifinals, we played against Joe Brennan, probably one of the strongest players in the room, on his version of Lurrus Saga. And now Joe had just won the New York tournament the week beforehand with this version of the deck and played against Show and Tell Oath in the finals, where he did win, but he, very clearly realized he had major problems with the matchup. And so there are multiple adjustments in this list specifically for the matchup. So there's a Drown in the Lock and a Repeal in the main. And then in the board, there are 2 Grafdigger's Cages and as well as a Feed the Swarm, which is the black enchantment removal. So lots of effort was put into making this deck better against the Show and Tell matchup, but Joe also agreed that the matchup is still pretty bad just because of the way my deck is interacting on the axis that my deck is interacting with. So this match is going to be on the YouTube VOD. But this is not a very competitive match. I've kind of just high rolled very hard. Basically jammed. I had a really nice flash in one of the games where I like played around certain pieces of counter magic, played a flash in upkeep, and my flash hit like Time Walk, Ancestral, Lotus, Oath. Like it was just like the best possible flash Atraxa of all time. And even though my opponent had answers to Time Walk, Oath, and Spell Pierce, like they couldn't Spell Pierce because I played Time Walk with 2 extra mana, and then I played a Lotus and played Oath with 3 extra mana. And basically, I just high rolled the crap out of this game. Similar kind of thing happens in game 2 where I play an early Oath, and then no, game 2 was different. Game 2 was really weird actually. Game 2 was like a Wasteland game where it was a Black Lotus from Joe, and then I misstepped a Ponder, and right after the Ponder gets misstepped, the 2 cards are Soul Ring, Grafdigger's Cage, and notably Grafdigger's Cage stops Oath, but it doesn't stop Show and Tell. And so although Joe had baited the misstep with the Ponder, he actually didn't really find a lot of mana to work with afterwards, so it was like a Soul Ring and a Grafdigger's Cage in play, and like a Wasteland, so like you can buy the Lurrus, but you can't get a Black Lotus, or like you can't cast it unless you draw a Black Lotus. So we kind of played a game where Joe was like wastelanding me, but I just had a ton of lands. And so I played all my lands out and then eventually Show and Tell and Atraxa. And that was just good enough. So even though this list is definitely teched a little bit to help in the matchup, it's very hard for a creature-based like controlling deck to battle versus Oath. It's just, especially when you're not playing white, so you're stuck with things like Feed the Swarm as your way to deal, and Repeal to deal with the Resolved Oath of Druids. So just a very hard matchup. This is a really cool build. I'm not 100% sold that this build is better than the current builds. Dark Confidant is obviously, I actually think this card is very good in the deck, but it's not good in the mirror because of Orcish Bowmaster. But against like the other blue decks, which is something that Joe definitely tunes to beat a lot of the time. This Dark Confidant looked very good from what I saw. There's also this Skull Clamp in the Wish, and not the Wish board, but the Saga board. There's a Skull Clamp and there's a Shadow Sphere. I think I like both of those things. Skull Clamp giving you extra ways to get rid of your Confidant in the kind of a high mana cost Confidant deck with Lorien Revealed, Negation, and Will. I thought that was like pretty neat deck building. So definitely a list that's worth trying out, but your mileage may vary if you're not Joe Brennan. So I was very happy to be playing a deck that had an edge versus Joe's deck of choice. And then I get to go on to the finals. And the finals was a match versus Squee, Countervine. In general, I think this is a good matchup, but it can definitely go badly. And I have a lot of cards for the matchup, but the cards don't matter if your Squee opponent keeps a 7-card hand. And my Squee opponent kept a 7-card hand, a 7-card hand, and a 6-card hand. What happened? Game 1, I know my opponent is on Squee, so I'm like mulliganing looking for an early Oath or Show and Tell. And I think I just like don't have the velocity needed to beat a 7-card hand. So I just like die in game 1. Game 2, and this video is also going to be on the YouTube VOD. Game 2, I remember keeping a hand that I thought was okay, but not amazing. Like there's so many amazing hands for the Oath deck versus Squee because you have ley lines, you have Show and Tells, you have Oaths, and you basically just have tons and tons of like lights out haymakers in the matchup. But my hand was something like turn 1 Demonic Tutor with Force and extra lands. Like it was a good hand, but not like an amazing hand. And I thought I made a really strong play in the game 2 where I could Demonic Tutor for Oath, Show and Tell, or Flash. And I chose to go for Flash in an effort because I was on the play, because Flash can't be negated if you play it on their upkeep, and that should build me enough card advantage to be able to overpower their next play. And so I ended up going for Flash Atraxa, and I think it ended up being almost just enough. It was very close. Because I remember like thinking a lot in that game how it was like if opponent had like a really nice activation and found the snapback immediately, there was like a way where, because I think I ended up putting a Sarah's Emissary in play. Oh, what it was, and I think I didn't draw enough blue cards. So I ended up with not enough blue cards to force back up my Show and Tell, which is like really crucial. But I just had to jam it anyways, because if I waited too long, they would just like outdraw me with the squeeze. So I ended up jamming a Show and Tell for a Sarah's Emissary. And then I was like, does this Sarah's Emissary name instant or does it name creature? Because if you have like a Sarah's Emissary and they don't have a lot of creatures, you can block the creatures and make it immune to snapback by naming instant. But it doesn't have vigilance, so you can't block with it and attack. Ended up choosing creature and attacking, and that was good enough. And then game 3 was wild because my opponent's hand was pretty strong. I remember probing my opponent's hand, and it was like double Force of Will with double Master of Death in the yard. And like Hollow 1 and Chalice on 0. And so this matchup was like really rough. And I was like, okay, Chalice on 0 is fine. I don't have any Moxen in my hand. And then I immediately drew Leyline. But opponent ended up... I don't think it ended up mattering because I do think I top decked the second Force. But opponent ended up like taking a more aggressive Bazaar activation where they were able to get a second Hollow 1 and a Wasteland to protect against Tabernacle. But, so they chose to keep their Wasteland to protect against Tabernacle. Sorry, I drew Lotus, and then I drew Leyline. So the two worst draws in my deck back to back. And so I drew. So yeah, they were on the play. So they went Bazaar activate, Chalice on 0, which I didn't counter because I had no zeros. And then a Hollow 1, which I didn't counter because I had an Oath with no orchards. My hand was like 2 lands, Oath, Force, blue card, some other cards. Maybe it was like a Show and Tell 2 or something. I don't exactly remember. But then, so I untap, I immediately draw Black Lotus, so I can't cast that. I probe my opponent's hand, paying the mana with my Underground Sea, and I saw the double force hand with the 2 masters. Yeah, so on their turn, they activate Bazaar, which I don't think they have to do. They might just be able to get away with not activating Bazaar, holding open double force with 2 masters. And then if I don't do anything that requires forcing, they can just end of turn activate their Bazaar. But instead, they chose to activate the Bazaar, which I don't even think is like that bad of a play, but it's definitely on the more aggressive side. And so what happens is they play a second Hollow One in a Wasteland, and then they have to make the choice of, do they Wasteland me to keep me off of mana, or do they hold Wasteland so they don't get their 2 Hollow Ones tabernacled, possibly. They chose to wait and hold off against Tabernacle. But what they didn't know is I didn't have a Tabernacle in my deck. Probably the majority of lists in Vintage for Oath play a Tabernacle on the side. I just chose not to because I knew I had like extra cards with Sarah's Emissary and Sphinx. And so I didn't actually have an extra land. So I was very lucky to be able to get my second land drop, play Oath with Force backup, force their 1 force because they didn't have both of the masters in their hand. And I was able to resolve Oath and resolve a trigger. I resolve my Oath trigger, and it mills over 3 Force of Wills and hits a Sarah's Emissary. And I tank for a while before naming creature, and they instantly snap back, but I actually had drawn the second Force of Will for turn on the last turn. So I had the Force for the snapback. I think if I didn't have the Force in my hand, I probably would have named instant and played a little bit of a longer game, because a second Oath trigger would have been lethal anyways. And so I guess it doesn't really matter that my opponent didn't hold up double force, because I would have ended up having double force backup off the top of my deck, which is pretty crazy. And so, yeah, ended up winning that final game 3. Crazy, crazy, crazy match. And then, boom. Hold up the trophy. This is a really cool trophy. I like that they have this trophy. I get my name on here. Won a nice looking unlimited time vault. So basically a perfect weekend. Not gonna lie. Didn't lose any matches. Played a bunch of Vintage, drank a bunch of beer. Before the finals, I was like, hey, you want to just go grab a round of beer before we play our finals? And so we just both went and had beers. So we got to drink beers while playing the final, which I think is the perfect way to play Vintage. Got a little trophy as well. I can put it up in the trophy case. Got this little guy. So I got this little trophy. Got to hold up the big trophy. Nice time vault for prizes. Then I just went off and went to the restaurant, talked to some of the Magic guys, got more beer, got a nice dinner, and then I actually got to actually, it was really cool. After the event, there were 8 players doing a Vintage Cube high roller for a Mox. So I basically just got to drink beer and watch more high level Vintage Cube after the event. I'm actually very happy I didn't play in that event, because I was pretty drunk at that point, and I went to bed probably 2 hours before the cube even finished. So, but I got to basically finish my event, get my dinner, and then go drink and watch more Vintage Cube. So pretty perfect. No. So yeah, that was the whole event. That was the whole shebang. That was really fun. It's really great to play Paper Vintage, and obviously it's always good to do some winning. I hope and think that there will be more Vintage events held by this organizer. And I think there will be. So we'll try to go out and see if we can play in those as well. I don't think there are any changes I'd like to immediately make to this list. I think it did exactly what I wanted it to do. One thing to think about is Lorien Revealed. Does this Oath list want to play Lorien Revealed? I am currently leaning towards no. But there were certainly players who played this weekend who thought Lorien Revealed was good in the deck, and I could definitely see it being true. So that's something to think about. I also think there's maybe some room to try to find a spot for a third Boseiju, maybe in the sideboard. But yeah. So that's it. That's the recap of my Buffalo Chicken Dip Legacy Vintage Open win. Thanks for watching. If you want to see more vintage content, there's gameplay Monday, Wednesday, and Friday on this YouTube channel. I will see you then.